Welcome to Lotus Light Teachings, a space where ancient wisdom meets modern life. Today, we're diving into a topic that many struggle with but few truly understand: the power of choosing solitude over negative company. Have you ever felt emotionally drained after spending time with certain people? Perhaps it was a conversation filled with complaints, gossip, or negativity that left you feeling unsettled. And yet, despite knowing this, you stayed. Why? In this video, we will explore why the company we keep profoundly shapes our minds, emotions, and decisions. We will uncover powerful Buddhist wisdom on how solitude can bring clarity, inner peace, and a deeper connection to yourself. I will share a compelling story of a young monk who lost himself in a world of distractions, and how he found his way back. So, if you've ever questioned whether solitude is a weakness or a strength, if you've ever wondered whether you're surrounding yourself with the right people, stay with me. This might be the insight you've been searching for. Green circle opening. The unseen influence of those around us. Have you ever stepped into a room and immediately sensed the energy within it? Some spaces feel light, inspiring, and peaceful. Others feel heavy, like they are pulling something from you rather than adding to you. Now, think about the people in your life. Have you ever left a conversation feeling completely drained? Not because the person was necessarily cruel, but because their presence seemed to dampen your spirit? Maybe it was a friend who always found something to complain about, a colleague who turned every challenge into a crisis, or a family member who never truly listened. And yet, despite knowing how they make you feel, you stay. Why? Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's obligation. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because the thought of being alone is more unsettling than the weight of their company. But here's the truth. The people we spend time with shape us in ways we rarely notice, until it's too late. Buddhism teaches that the mind is like soft clay, constantly being molded by its environment. If we surround ourselves with negativity, we absorb it. If we are in an environment of gossip, fear, or recklessness, it becomes a part of us. Slowly, subtly, until we forget who we once were. But solitude offers something different. It gives us the space to clear our minds, to hear our own thoughts, and to return to the truth of who we are. And that brings me to a story of a monk who thought he could change the world, only to realize the world had changed him. Blue circle, the story of the monk and the drunken village. There was once a young monk who traveled to a village known for its indulgence and recklessness. He had come with the purest of intentions, to guide the people toward a more mindful, peaceful way of living. At first, he remained steadfast in his practice. He meditated daily. He spoke words of wisdom to anyone who would listen. He believed he could help. But over time, something began to change. He started joining the villagers at their gatherings, at first just to observe. Then, one evening, he accepted a drink, telling himself it was harmless. Before long, he found himself laughing at crude jokes, indulging in habits he once shunned, and drifting further from his practice. One day, his teacher visited him. The young monk, now barely recognizable, was sitting among a drunken crowd, his robes stained, his eyes clouded. The teacher did not scold him. He simply smiled and said, "A fish cannot survive in polluted water for too long." In that moment, the young monk understood. He had come to change the village, but in reality, it was the village that had changed him. That night, he packed his belongings and left. He returned to solitude, where he could regain his clarity, his wisdom, and his sense of self. Orange circle, what this means for us. How often do we tell ourselves, "I can handle it. I won't be affected. It's just a little gossip. I won't participate." They're always negative, but that doesn't mean I have to be. I know this environment is unhealthy, but I've been here for so long. We convince ourselves that we are immune, that we can stand in a polluted river and not get wet. But just like the young monk, we don't always realize the impact until we've already drifted too far from who we once were. So I ask you, who and what is shaping your mind right now? Are the people around you lifting you up, challenging you to grow, and bringing you peace? Or are they keeping you stuck, making you doubt yourself, and filling your mind with noise? If you are constantly surrounded by negativity, distractions, or energy-draining interactions, how can you ever hear your own wisdom? The courage to choose solitude. Choosing solitude over negative company is not about isolation or rejecting others. It is about creating a space where your thoughts can breathe, where your mind can settle, and where you can hear the voice of wisdom within you. It takes courage to step away, to say no to friendships that no longer serve you, to distance yourself from environments that cloud your clarity. But the reward? Peace, strength, self-awareness. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that your thoughts are lighter, your emotions are clearer, and your energy is no longer drained. That is the gift of solitude. That is the clarity that comes when you remove yourself from the noise. A simple practice to find clarity. If you are unsure whether a person or environment is negatively influencing you, try this. Spend 1 week in minimal contact. If possible, step away from their influence for a short period. Limit conversations, interactions, and time spent in their space. Keycap 2. Notice how you feel. Do you feel lighter? More at peace? Is your mind clearer? Keycap 3. Compare the two states. If solitude brings you clarity, then perhaps that relationship or environment was clouding it. You don't need to cut people out of your life abruptly, but you do need to be intentional about who and what you allow into your mental space. The power of choosing solitude over negative company. A journey to inner clarity. Have you ever felt drained after spending time with certain people? Not because they were particularly cruel or unkind, but because their presence seemed to weigh down your spirit? Maybe it was a friend who always saw the worst in every situation, or a colleague whose negativity turned even the smallest inconvenience into a crisis. And yet, despite feeling exhausted after being with them, you stayed. Perhaps out of habit, out of fear of loneliness, or simply because the thought of walking away felt uncomfortable. But here's the thing, who we spend time with is not just a trivial choice. It shapes us in ways we rarely notice until much later. The unseen influence of those around us. Buddhism teaches that our minds are like soft clay, constantly being molded by our surroundings. If we are in an environment filled with negativity, gossip, or recklessness, we absorb it, consciously or unconsciously. But when we choose solitude, even temporarily, we create space for clarity, wisdom, and self-awareness to emerge. I once heard a simple yet profound analogy. A clear glass of water becomes murky when a drop of ink is added, but let the water sit still, undisturbed, and eventually, the ink settles, leaving clarity once again. This is what solitude does for us. It allows the ink, the noise, the expectations, the outside influences to settle so we can see things as they truly are. But what happens when we refuse to step away from a toxic environment? The story of the monk and the drunken village. There's an old Buddhist story that speaks to this. A young monk once traveled to a village known for its reckless and indulgent lifestyle. He had come with the purest of intentions, to guide the people toward mindfulness and inner peace. At first, he remained steadfast in his practice, meditating daily, teaching those who were willing to listen. But over time, things began to shift. He started joining the villagers in their gatherings, just to observe. Then, one evening, he accepted a drink, telling himself it was harmless. Before he realized it, he was laughing at jokes he once found crude, indulging in habits he once shunned. One day, his teacher visited him and found the young monk in the midst of a drunken crowd. His robe stained, his eyes clouded. The teacher did not scold him. He simply smiled and said, "A fish cannot survive in polluted water for too long." In that moment, the monk understood. He had believed he could change the village, but in reality, it was the village that had changed him. That night, he packed his belongings and left, returning to solitude where he could regain his clarity and wisdom. What this means for us. How often do we tell ourselves that we can stay in a toxic environment without being affected? It's just a little gossip. I won't participate. They're always negative, but that doesn't mean I have to be. I know they drain my energy, but they've been in my life for so long. We convince ourselves that we are immune, that we can stand in a polluted river and not get wet. But just like the young monk, we don't always realize the impact until we've already drifted far from who we once were. So the question is, who and what is shaping your mind right now? The courage to choose solitude. Choosing solitude over negative company is not about isolating yourself or rejecting others. It's about creating a space where your thoughts can breathe, where your mind can settle, and where you can hear the voice of wisdom within you. It takes courage to step away, to say no to friendships that no longer serve you, to distance yourself from environments that cloud your clarity. But the reward? Peace, strength, self-awareness. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that your thoughts are lighter, your emotions clearer, and your energy no longer drained. That is the gift of choosing solitude when needed. A simple practice to find clarity. If you're unsure whether a person or environment is negatively influencing you, try this. 1. Spend 1 week in minimal contact. If possible, step away from their influence for a short period. Limit conversations, interactions, and time spent in their space. 2. Notice how you feel. Do you feel lighter? More at peace? Is your mind clearer? 3. Compare the two states. If solitude brings you clarity, then perhaps that relationship or environment was clouding it. Final reflection. Ask yourself, am I choosing company out of fear of being alone, or because it truly nourishes me? If I spent more time in solitude, what wisdom might I discover within myself? What parts of my life have become polluted water? And how can I step away to regain clarity? Remember, solitude is not a void. It is not emptiness. It is a sacred space where your true self can emerge. And in that space, wisdom flourishes, clarity returns, and you become your own source of strength. Spending time alone to truly know yourself, a journey inward. Have you ever noticed how loud the world has become? Everywhere you go, there's noise, notifications buzzing, conversations overlapping, the hum of life moving at full speed. And in the midst of all this, have you ever wondered, when was the last time I truly listened to myself? Not just hearing your thoughts in passing, but really listening, without distractions, without expectations, without the noise of the world interfering. For many of us, the idea of sitting alone with our thoughts is unsettling. We fill our time with tasks, people, and entertainment, not realizing that, in doing so, we are avoiding the one person we should know best, ourselves. But here's a truth that few dare to embrace. Solitude is where you meet yourself, and in that meeting, you uncover the wisdom, strength, and clarity that have always been within you. Why are we afraid of ourselves? It's strange, isn't it? We spend our entire lives in our own company, yet many of us are strangers to ourselves. Why is that? Perhaps it's because we are conditioned to seek answers outside of us. From childhood, we are told what to think, how to behave, and what success should look like. Our identities are shaped by expectations of family, society, and culture. And so, when we are finally alone, without any distractions, we feel a certain unease. Because in that silence, we are faced with a question we may have avoided for years. Who am I really? This is why solitude is not just about being alone. It is about unlearning, peeling away the layers of who we were told to be, and discovering who we truly are. The story of a king who sought himself. There is an old Buddhist story about a great king who had everything: power, wealth, admiration. Yet despite his success, he felt empty. No matter how much he achieved, the feeling lingered. One day, he sought the advice of a wise monk and asked, "Why do I feel lost despite having everything?" The monk smiled and handed the king a cup of tea. "Drink," he said. The king took a sip. The monk then poured more tea, filling the cup to the brim, and continued pouring until it overflowed. "Why do you keep pouring? The cup is full," the king exclaimed. The monk nodded. "Just like your mind. It is full of titles, responsibilities, the opinions of others. How can you find yourself when there is no space left within?" The king understood. He left his palace for a time, retreating into solitude. Away from the noise of the court, he finally confronted his thoughts. In stillness, he found clarity. In solitude, he met himself. How solitude reveals who you are. There is a reason why many great thinkers, artists, and spiritual leaders have sought solitude, not as an escape, but as a path to self-discovery. Buddhism teaches that self-awareness is the foundation of wisdom. When you allow yourself to be alone, without distractions, something remarkable happens. 1. You begin to hear your true thoughts. Not the borrowed beliefs from others, not the expectations society placed upon you, but your own voice, raw and unfiltered. 2. You confront your fears instead of avoiding them. Often, we distract ourselves to avoid difficult emotions. But in solitude, we realize that fear is just another passing cloud. It is not who we are. 3. You uncover what truly matters. Without external influences pulling you in different directions, you gain clarity about your values, dreams, and what brings you joy. Practical ways to meet yourself through solitude. So, how do you begin this journey? How do you create space in your life to truly know yourself? Here are 4 simple yet powerful practices. Meditate daily, even just 10 minutes of sitting in silence. Observing your breath can shift your awareness inward. Meditation is not about controlling your thoughts. It's about witnessing them. Keycap 2. Keep a journal. Write without filters. Let your thoughts spill onto the page. Over time, you will see patterns in your thinking and gain insight into your inner world. Keycap 3. Take solo walks in nature. No phone. No music. Just walk. Observe your surroundings. Notice how your mind wanders, and gently bring it back to the present moment. Keycap 4. Limit external noise. Reduce the constant input from social media, news, and entertainment. Create moments of stillness throughout your day. What you will find in the silence. At first, solitude may feel uncomfortable. Your mind might resist. It will reach for distractions. But if you stay with it, if you sit in that silence long enough, you will start to hear something profound yourself. You may realize that the answers you have been seeking were never outside of you, that the peace you have been chasing was always within you, that you do not need to be anyone other than who you already are. So, I ask you, when was the last time you sat alone, without distractions, and truly listened? And if the answer is, I don't remember, maybe today is the perfect day to begin. Overcoming the fear of being alone, finding strength in solitude. There's a certain silence that makes people uncomfortable. A room with no conversation, a walk with no companion, an evening with no notifications or distractions. For many, these moments feel empty, almost unnatural, like something is missing. But is it really emptiness, or is it just unfamiliar? How often do we seek company not because we genuinely need it, but because we fear the quiet? How many times do we fill our schedules, our screens, our lives with endless interactions just to avoid facing ourselves? We often mistake solitude for loneliness, but the two are not the same. Loneliness is the ache for something outside of us. Solitude is the peace found within. And learning to embrace solitude is not just about being alone. It's about discovering that you are enough. Why do we fear being alone? If we're being honest, it's not the silence we fear. It's what the silence might reveal. Because in solitude, there is no one to distract us from our own thoughts. No one to validate our existence. No one to reflect back to us who we think we should be. And for many, that is unsettling. From childhood, we are taught that connection equals happiness. We are praised for being social, for being surrounded by people, for being liked. Society tells us that a full life is one filled with conversations, relationships, and constant engagement. And while meaningful relationships are indeed beautiful, the truth is, happiness cannot be outsourced. Buddhism teaches that the root of suffering is attachment to people, to expectations, to the need for external validation. When we fear being alone, we are unknowingly placing our happiness in the hands of others, believing that we are only whole when someone else is near. But what if we saw solitude not as a void, but as a sanctuary? What if, instead of fearing it, we leaned into it? The monk who found home in silence. Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Vietnamese Zen master, spent much of his life teaching about mindfulness and presence. Despite being surrounded by students and followers, he spoke often about the power of solitude. He once said, "To be alone does not mean to be lonely. It means to be in touch with the wonders of life within and around you." Even in the busiest moments of his life, he made solitude a priority. Whether through silent retreats, walking meditations, or simply sitting with a cup of tea in complete stillness, He practiced what he called coming home to oneself. For him, solitude was not isolation, it was a return. A return to presence, to self-awareness, to clarity. And isn't that what we all long for? Not just to exist in the world, but to truly be present in it. To hear our own thoughts without judgment, to sit with our own emotions without fear, to simply be without needing to be validated by another, transforming loneliness into strength. If you've ever felt uncomfortable in solitude, you are not alone. But the discomfort is not a punishment, it is an invitation. Because solitude, when embraced, can become a source of incredible strength. In solitude, you learn to trust yourself. In solitude, you become self-sufficient, emotionally independent. In solitude, you discover that you do not need to be surrounded to be whole. The greatest thinkers, artists, and leaders in history understood this. Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, Virginia Woolf, Steve Jobs. All of them spoke of solitude as essential to creativity, wisdom, and self-discovery. They did not fear being alone. They used it as fuel. A simple practice, befriending yourself. If being alone feels unsettling, try this. 1. Sit in silence for 5 minutes a day. No distractions, no music, no phone. Just sit. Observe your thoughts without judgment. Let them come and go. 2. Write a letter to yourself. If you were your own best friend, what would you say? Offer yourself kindness, encouragement, understanding. 3. Take a solo walk in nature. No podcast, no calls. Just you and the world around you. Notice the details. Listen to your own presence. A final thought. Perhaps the question is not, why am I alone? But rather, how can I make peace with myself? Because the truth is, we are always with ourselves. Every moment, every breath, every experience. And when we learn to befriend our own company, we unlock a freedom that no relationship, no distraction, no validation can ever replace. So, I leave you with this. Are you running from solitude? Or are you ready to embrace it? Finding your true self through solitude, a journey inward. There is a moment in life when everything around you falls silent. No conversations, no distractions, no expectations pressing against your mind. And in that rare silence, a question may arise. Who am I truly? It's a simple question, yet one that few of us ever dare to answer. Not because we don't want to, but because we've spent most of our lives being told who we are. We grow up with labels: son, daughter, student, employee, friend, spouse. Society defines us by what we do, what we achieve, how others perceive us. And so, we move through life fulfilling roles, meeting expectations, trying to be what we think we should be. But what happens when all of that is stripped away? If you were to stand alone, without the validation of others, without the titles you hold, without the obligations you carry, who would you be? The illusion of a fixed identity. We often think of ourselves as fixed beings, as if who we are today is who we will always be. But Buddhism teaches that the self is not a solid, unchanging entity. Rather, it is like a river, always flowing, always shifting. Your thoughts today are not the same as they were 5 years ago. The things that once defined you, your career, your relationships, your desires, may not hold the same meaning tomorrow. Yet, we cling to our identities as if they are permanent. We attach ourselves to our roles, fearing that without them we might become nothing. But solitude offers us a different truth. You are not your job. You are not your past. You are not what society expects you to be. You are something far deeper, far more fluid, and infinitely more free. The story of the man who lost himself. There is an old Zen story about a man who spent his entire life trying to build an identity. He worked tirelessly to become successful, admired, and respected. He collected titles like treasures, thinking that each new achievement would bring him closer to his true self. One day, an old monk asked him, "Who are you?" The man smiled, proudly listing his accomplishments, his roles, his possessions. The monk shook his head. "I didn't ask what you have done. I asked, who are you?" The man hesitated. Without his titles, without his achievements, he didn't know what to say. The monk led him to a quiet lake. "Look into the water," he said. At first, the man saw his reflection, his face, his features, the image he had always known. But as he watched, the wind stirred the water, distorting his reflection. "This is who you think you are," the monk said. "A reflection, constantly shifting. But if you go deeper, beneath the surface, you will find something far more real." The man closed his eyes. In that stillness, away from all external definitions, he felt something he had never felt before himself. How solitude reveals the truth of who you are. Most of us live our lives at the surface, reacting to the waves, defining ourselves by what is reflected back at us. We let society, relationships, and achievements tell us who we are. But solitude invites us to dive deeper, to step away from the noise, the labels, the roles, and ask, what do I truly value? What brings me peace beyond what others expect? What parts of me have I been ignoring in the pursuit of who I should be? When you sit in solitude, you begin to see yourself without the distortion of the world's expectations. You notice thoughts that have been buried under busyness. You hear the quiet whisper of your own truth. And in that space, something shifts. You no longer need to prove yourself. You no longer need to be someone for the sake of others. You just are. A simple practice, the mirror meditation. If you have ever struggled to see yourself beyond your roles, try this. Find a quiet space and sit in front of a mirror. Keycap 2, look into your own eyes. Not your face, not your appearance, just your eyes. Keycap 3, observe your thoughts and emotions. Notice any discomfort, resistance, or self-judgment. Keycap 4, breathe. Stay present. Ask yourself, who am I beneath all of this? First, it may feel strange, but over time, you will begin to recognize something beyond the surface. Presence, a knowing. That is you. What will you find in the silence? Perhaps the real question is not, who am I? But rather, who am I when no one is watching? Because in that space, beyond expectations and labels, you will find something precious. Not a title, not an achievement, not a role to fulfill. You will find yourself, the strength of independence, trusting yourself in a noisy world. There's a moment in life when you realize that no one is coming to save you. No one else can walk your path, face your fears, or make decisions for you. It's a sobering thought at first, but if you sit with it long enough, you'll see. It's also incredibly freeing. Because if no one else is responsible for your happiness, your success, or your peace of mind, then that power rests entirely in your hands. But here's the challenge. Do you trust yourself enough to hold it? Why do we seek external validation? Have you ever caught yourself waiting for permission to act? Maybe before making a big decision, you run it by 5 different people. Maybe you hesitate to share your ideas, wondering what others might think. Maybe you check your phone more times than you'd like to admit, craving reassurance from a message, like a response. Why do we do this? From a young age, we are conditioned to seek approval. Parents, teachers, society, they reward us when we follow the rules, when we fit the mold, when we do what's expected. Over time, we start outsourcing our confidence. Instead of asking, is this right for me? We ask, will others approve? And just like that, we hand over our power, our ability to trust ourselves, to the opinions of the world. But Buddhism teaches something radically different. The answer is not out there. The answer is within. The story of the lost traveler. There's an old Zen story about a man who found himself lost in the mountains. The sun was setting, and the path forward was unclear. In the distance, he saw 2 travelers walking toward him. Relieved, he ran to them and asked, "Which way leads to the village?" One traveler pointed left. "That way is safe," he said. The other traveler shook his head. "No, take the path to the right. It's faster." The man hesitated. Both paths looked equally promising, yet both held uncertainty. The travelers continued on their way, leaving the man standing there, caught in indecision. Then, for the first time that day, he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. He listened not to the voices of others, but to himself. And in that silence, he knew which way to go. The power of self-reliance. How many times have you stood at a crossroads, unsure which path to take? How often have you looked outward, hoping someone else could make the choice for you? But here's the truth. No one else is living your life. No one else has to carry the weight of your choices. When you rely on external approval, you become a passenger in your own life, waiting for someone else to steer. But when you learn to trust yourself, to listen inward instead of outward, you take the wheel. This doesn't mean ignoring advice or shutting people out. It means knowing that, at the end of the day, your voice should be the loudest in your own life. Steps to cultivate independence. So how do we build this inner trust? How do we strengthen our ability to rely on ourselves? Make decisions without seeking approval. Next time you have a choice to make, pause before asking others. Instead, ask yourself, what do I truly want? Trust that answer. Keycap 2. Learn to enjoy your own company. If being alone feels uncomfortable, sit with it. Take yourself on a solo walk. Eat a meal alone without distractions. The more time you spend with yourself, the more comfortable you'll become in your own presence. Keycap 3. Develop skills that make you self-sufficient. Learn something new, cooking, budgeting, fixing things around the house. The more capable you feel, the less dependent you'll be on external support. Keycap 4. Trust your intuition. Your gut feeling exists for a reason. The next time you feel uncertain, instead of seeking endless opinions, take a moment to listen inward. A final thought. Independence is not about isolating yourself. It's about owning your choices, trusting your wisdom, and standing firm in your path. So, the next time you find yourself waiting for approval, ask yourself, do I trust myself enough to decide? And if the answer isn't yes yet, maybe it's time to start listening inward. Embracing self-companionship. Becoming your own best friend. Have you ever sat alone in a quiet room and felt a strange sense of unease? Not because anything was wrong, but because the silence itself felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. For many, being alone feels like an emptiness that needs to be filled. We scroll through our phones, turn on the TV, or reach out to someone, anyone, just to avoid the stillness. But have you ever wondered why? Why is it that we can offer kindness, patience, and love to others, yet struggle to do the same for ourselves? Why is it easier to be a good friend to someone else than to be a good companion to ourselves? Buddhism teaches that true peace comes from within, yet many of us spend our lives searching for it outside of ourselves. We chase relationships, achievements, and validation, believing they will complete us. But what if the key to fulfillment was not in being surrounded by others, but in learning to enjoy our own company? What if you could become your own best friend? The fear of being alone. We often equate solitude with loneliness, but they are not the same. Loneliness is the feeling of lack. Solitude is the presence of self. Many fear solitude because, in the absence of external distractions, they are left alone with their thoughts. And sometimes those thoughts are uncomfortable. We start to notice our insecurities, our worries, our self-doubts. Instead of facing them, we run. Toward noise, toward people, toward anything that keeps us from being truly alone. But here's the truth. Running doesn't make the discomfort disappear. It only postpones it. If you want to find true peace, you must stop running. You must sit with yourself as you would sit with a friend who is struggling. You must listen with patience and kindness instead of judgment. And most importantly, you must learn to be there for yourself. Not just when life is easy, but especially when it's hard. The story of the poet who found himself. There's a story about the great Persian poet Rumi. He once wrote, "Do not feel lonely. The entire universe is inside you." Rumi, like many great thinkers, spent much of his life in solitude. But he did not see it as isolation. He saw it as an opportunity to listen to the deepest parts of himself. One day, a student asked him, "Master, do you ever feel lonely?" Rumi smiled. "How can I be lonely when I am always with myself?" At first, the student did not understand. But over time, he realized what Rumi meant, that the quality of your own companionship determines whether solitude is peaceful or painful. If you are kind to yourself, solitude becomes a sanctuary. If you are harsh and judgmental, solitude feels like a prison. How to become your own best companion. So, how do we cultivate self-companionship? How do we become someone we actually enjoy spending time with? Speak to yourself with kindness. Pay attention to your inner dialogue. Would you speak to a close friend the way you speak to yourself? If not, change the tone. Be gentle. Be encouraging. Keycap 2. Enjoy your own presence. Do something you love. Alone. Read a book. Take a long walk. Sit by the ocean. Or simply have a quiet cup of tea. Learn to enjoy these moments as gifts, rather than gaps waiting to be filled. Keycap 3. Listen without judgment. When difficult emotions arise, don't push them away. Instead, ask yourself, if a friend were feeling this, what would I say to them? Then offer yourself the same compassion. Keycap 4. Create rituals of self-love. Set aside time to nurture yourself. Meditation, journaling, even something as simple as lighting a candle and sitting in stillness. These small acts remind you that you are worthy of your own care. The power of being at peace with yourself. When you learn to enjoy your own company, something magical happens. You stop feeling restless when alone. You stop looking for others to fill an internal void. You stop fearing solitude, because solitude is no longer empty. It is full of presence, of self-awareness, of peace. And most importantly, you realize that no matter what happens in life, who stays, who leaves, what changes, you will always have yourself. So, I ask you, are you a friend to yourself? Or are you a stranger? And if the answer is the latter, maybe it's time to start building that friendship. Valuing your individuality, the courage to be yourself. Have you ever felt like you needed to fit in? Like the world was nudging, sometimes pushing you toward becoming someone you're not? Maybe it was at work, where the culture demanded that you behave a certain way to be accepted. Maybe it was within your family, where expectations were placed on you before you even had the chance to discover who you truly were. Or maybe it was in society at large, where trends, norms, and unspoken rules quietly shaped the way you dressed, spoke, and lived. It happens to all of us. At some point, we feel the pressure to mold ourselves to fit a certain image, to be normal, to belong. But in doing so, we often sacrifice something precious, our individuality. So let me ask you, who would you be if the world had never told you who to be? That question alone can be unsettling because it forces us to realize just how much of our identity has been shaped by external influences. But Buddhism, and many of the world's greatest thinkers, remind us that true happiness comes not from fitting in, but from embracing who we truly are. The fear of standing alone. Why is it so difficult to embrace our individuality? At its core, the fear of being different is deeply rooted in our survival instincts. Thousands of years ago, being part of a group meant protection, security, and a greater chance of survival. To be cast out, to be alone was dangerous. That instinct still lingers today. We want to belong. We want to be accepted. But here's where it gets complicated. Belonging at the cost of authenticity is not true belonging at all. If people accept you for the version of yourself that you have curated to please them, they are not truly accepting you. They are accepting a performance. So ask yourself, do I want to be liked for who I really am, or for who I pretend to be? The story of the lion who thought he was a sheep. There is an old Buddhist parable about a lion cub who was separated from his mother and raised by a herd of sheep. Since he had never seen another lion, he believed he was a sheep too. He bleated like a sheep, grazed like a sheep, and ran in fear whenever danger appeared. One day, an old lion saw him among the flock and was bewildered. "What are you doing among these sheep?" he asked. The young lion trembled. "I am a sheep," he replied. The old lion took him to a still pond and said, "Look at your reflection." For the first time, the young lion saw his own face, not the woolly form of a sheep, but the strong golden mane of a lion. In that moment, he realized the truth. He had never been a sheep. He had always been a lion. But because he had never been told otherwise, he had lived his entire life believing something that wasn't true. How many of us are like that lion? How many of us have spent years believing that we are something we are not, just because the world told us so? The power of embracing your true self. When you stop trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for you, something incredible happens. You stop seeking approval. You stop apologizing for being different. You stop comparing yourself to others. Instead, you start living fully, freely, and in alignment with who you are meant to be. Buddhism teaches that freedom comes from within. It is not about breaking free from rules or expectations. It is about breaking free from the illusion that you must be someone other than yourself in order to be worthy. The moment you realize that you are already enough, exactly as you are, you stop chasing external validation. And in that stillness, in that moment of truth, you finally feel at peace. Practical ways to embrace your individuality. Of course, understanding this is one thing. Living it is another. How do we start embracing who we are, especially when we have spent years trying to fit in? Spend time in solitude. When you remove external influences, you give yourself space to hear your own voice. Sit in silence, take a walk alone, or meditate. Ask yourself, what do I truly want? Who am I beneath all of these expectations? Stop comparing yourself to others. Your path is yours alone. The more you measure yourself against others, the more you lose sight of your own uniqueness. Instead of thinking, am I as successful as them? Ask, am I being true to myself? Express yourself authentically, whether it's through your words, your actions, or your creative pursuits. Be unapologetically yourself. If you love something, embrace it. If you have a different perspective, share it. The world does not need another copy of someone else. It needs you. Let go of the need for approval. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will like you. That's okay. The people who truly matter will accept you as you are, and those who don't were never meant to be in your life. The final question. There is a quote often attributed to the Buddha. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. So let me ask you one last time. Are you living as the lion that you are? Or are you still believing you are a sheep? And if today were the day you finally stepped into your true self, who would you become? Solitude is not a void. It is not loneliness. It is a sacred space where your true self can emerge. And in that space, wisdom flourishes, clarity returns, and you become your own source of strength. So, I leave you with this. Are you choosing company out of fear of being alone, or because it truly nourishes you? If you spent more time in solitude, what wisdom might you discover within yourself? What parts of your life have become polluted water? And how can you step away to regain clarity? If this message resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let's create a conversation that inspires each other to see solitude not as loneliness, but as a path to clarity and peace. And if you found value in this video, like, share, and subscribe to help spread this wisdom to others. Until next time, may you find strength in your solitude.